everyone to our next lecture in the series Illicit Objects, Lived Religion. I'm Joseph Sanzo, and I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Lived Religion. And today I'm delighted to introduce Linda Zampol d'OrtiA, who is a young research fellow at Foscari University of Venice, where she is developing a project on the role of emotional practices in producing and justifying new structures of power in 16th and 17th century extra-European Catholic missions. Her research interests include Christianity in Japan, early modern Catholic missions, gender history, the history of Asia, Europe contacts, materiality, emotions, and failure studies. She's recently co-edited a special issue of the Journal of Religious History on gender and emotions in pre-modern Japanese Christianity. And today she'll be talking about abortion and infanticide in Japan during the 16th and 17th century. So, Linda, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much also for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be presenting part of my research. So just a small note before we start. Of course, I will be discussing themes such as abortions and infanticides. And I would like to stress that I'm talking about them as a single issue because that is the interpretation that both the Japanese and the Europeans had in Sengoku, Japan, of this phenomenon. So we will be discussing in general, although they are quite different, of course. We will be discussing them together. Neither the Japanese people nor the European missionaries appeared too invested to invest particular importance in the moment of birth, which is why we will be discussing them in this way. Okay, so disclaimer. This presentation is part of my project, Young Researchers Fellow, Emo Powers, which is titled Emotional Practices, Power Relations and Asymmetrical Dependencies in Catholic Missions, and is financed through the program Next Generation EU. Let's give a bit of historical background then. The early modern mission to Japan was founded by the Catholic Order of the Society of Jesus in 1549. As the Jesuit mission developed quickly throughout the country, its presence was mostly concentrated in the southern island of Kyushu and in the more central area of Kinai, with the capital Kyoto, the port city of Sakai, and Osaka. The Jesuits boasted a high number of conversions and counted 300,000 Christians at the beginning of the 17th century. This new community can be referred to as the kirishitan community, from the transliteration into Japanese of the Portuguese term cristão. The Jesuits arrived in Japan during the politically unstable Sengoku era, a period characterized by civil war that had divided the country in numerous smaller territories, generally governed by a warlord called Sengoku daimyo, or daimyo for short. As daimyo Toyotomi Hideyoshi moved to conquer most of the country in the early 1580s, he identified the Christian mission as an obstacle to the process of unification of Japan under his control, and published an edict of expulsion in 1587. Even if the European missionaries did not, in practice, leave the country, the Christian presence in Japan came effectively to an end with the rise to power of the Tokugawa shogunate and its bans on Catholicism in 1611 and 1614. And indeed, the Japanese mission went down in history of that period as a land of martyrdom. This talk will focus on how the role of emotions in the mission impacted the missionaries' knowledge production on Japanese people, which they then introduced to Europe, since they basically had a monopoly on it, and how the same role of emotions impacted the lived religion of the Kirishitan people by presenting affective models to them that offered assemblages of emotional practices. Our case study today is the practices of abortion and infanticide in 16th century Japan, which were illicit under Catholic law, and the emotion of love, or lack thereof, which were at the root of these same practices, according to the Catholic worldview. Let's now consider a little bit of theory. Due to its common understanding of the nature of emotions, which they called motions of the soul, following theologian Thomas Aquinas, and of the consolatory nature of their ministry, the Society of Jesus can be considered an emotional community. In her seminal study, Barbara Rosenwein defined emotional communities as a group in which people adhere to the same norms of emotional expression and value, or they value the same or related emotions. By definition, emotional communities are all imagined communities, which require constant confirmation and consolidation by their members. They were often set within the context of bigger emotional communities, in this case, as we can see here, the Catholic one. They could also overlap with other communities, such the Franciscan emotional community clearly shared some elements in common with the Jesuit one. Still, each community shared some exclusive understandings, definitions, expressions, and practices of emotions that unified and marked them. Jesuit missions were part of this larger Jesuit global emotional community, but were also specific groups if taken by themselves. Even better, they were a combination of more than one community, which developed within what we would call nowadays regional or citywide contexts. This is the case of the Japanese mission. If Barbara Rosenwein introduced the concept of emotional communities, Monique Shia tackled the matter from a different perspective when she proposed the concept of the emotion as practice. This approach, based on Pierre Bourdieu, highlighted emotions' bodily nature and their role in mobilizing, expressing, and regulating feelings. This paper, therefore, starts from the key tenets of the field of the history of emotions, which proposes that emotions are cultural products that can change through history. Otherwise, we won't be able to really say much about them. How does the Japanese mission fit in this picture? The Jesuits believed that the Japanese were rationally capable of understanding Christian tenets, and therefore of converting in an informed way. This was a key rhetorical point to emphasize Japanese superiority over other non-European peoples, whose conversion had been disappointed or perceived as only apparent, such as Jewish, Muslim, or Indian people. The objective of this framing was typically to point out how the latest people, let's say, discovered, differed from previous people discovered, in hope for a different outcome. All this said, one would expect, therefore, very few references to emotional practices in the sources. Yet the opposite is true. Jesuit textual sources from Japan are full of references to emotions. Very briefly, my sources are of this kind. Jesuit letters written from Japan. We have a very ample collection of them. We have then histories of the mission composed by missionaries who had worked in Japan, such as this one, written by Alessandro Valignano. Then we have manuscripts that supported the work of the Jesuits in the country, and also their learning of the Japanese language. As you can see, this text is written in Latin letters, but it's actually Japanese. And finally, we also have printed texts that were introduced in the 17th century and could be distributed among the community or used again by the missionaries. So these are more or less my sources. So After seeing the historical context and the theory, let's turn to our case study. Basically, as soon as they landed in the archipelago, the missionaries began preaching against the practices of infanticide and abortion that they described as extremely common in Japan. Or at least this is what the Historia de Japon, written by Louis Froich, tells us some 35 years after the events. We have to take his word for that. So, practices of abortions, and especially infanticide in Japan, have been the object of much debate. Although recent research suggests that they were not quantitatively significant as previously believed, while references to these practices can be traced back at least to the 10th century, most of the relevant historical documents date to the Edo period, when the Tokugawa shogunate and many domains issued bans against them. An overview of the vocabulary used in the decades of 1860 and 1870 indicates that different attitudes toward abortion and infanticides existed in Japan, even if they were carried out in most of the country. Traditionally, poverty has been singled out as their cause, but maintaining the family's social status and its estate by controlling expenditure was also an important preoccupation. In regions where these practices were accepted, and again, they were not all of Japan, but in these regions, there was the perception that infants could be returned to the supernatural world of the kami, whence they had come. Buddhist cosmology, too, could inform these practices. So both Buddha worship and kami worship actually could support and inform abortions and specifically infanticides. Whatever the extension of these practices, the missionaries felt that they needed to focus their energies on banning them. Medieval Christianity categorized abortions and infanticides as sins against love, that is, caritas more specifically, by the mother. So it's a sin of the mother, understanding them as forms of homicide. By the 1560s, therefore, in Japan, we find them embedded into a wider discourse on the Japanese people's inability to love. They were banded together with other accusations toward the Japanese people, such as having barbaric forms of government. And overall, the picture that is depicted by the missionaries that Japanese people did not know how to love. And this, as I said, was a thorny issue because love was the theological virtue even before being emotion of the soul, right? Let's remember Paul's letters. So to solve this issue, the Jesuits set out to reshape Japanese motherhood according to European categories. Two models for women, characterized by very different emotional practices, emerge from kirishitan literature developed in Japan and distributed among missionaries and converts alike. Unsurprisingly, they were both embodied by the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary was central in a significant number of kirishitan cults. The reason behind this prominence are arguably many, starting with the promotion of her figure by the Catholic Church during the Counter-Reformation. Following this tradition, Mary was presented as the most powerful intercessor with Jesus Christ and preserver of faithful and sinners alike. We have here some examples of practices of worship. We have common prayers, such as the Ave Maria and Salve Regina, which were both translated to guarantee a perfect understanding of their meaning. The use of the rosary, which worked parallel to the Buddhist rosary, was also very common. We have an extremely popular apotropaic invocation of the name Zensumaru, which was a unification of the names Jesus Maria. We have 4 calendrical feasts: the purification of Our Lady, the Annunciation, the Assumption, and the Nativity. And also we have a special 5th feast called O Mamorino Santa Maria, Our Lady of Protection. Again, this idea that Mary protects the faithful, which was set on the day of the Japanese New Year's, so Shogatsu. We also have a wide collection of images and statues, such as this portable oratory. And then we know that the figure of Maruya-sama was the main character of the beginning of Heaven and Earth, which was a textual collection of the hidden Christians, so the Japanese who actually hid their faith but remained Christians during the 17th and the 19th century. So she was a very central figure, really. Okay, so these examples of practices of worship answer principally to the need of superhuman protection expressed by the Japanese. If this need was probably caused by the uncertainties and upheavals of the civil war at the beginning, and by the persecution of kirishitan by the government later, in Japan, Christianity was also competing with Buddhism to demonstrate its superior power on everyday life, as Alan Strathern has very recently delineated very well. Jesuit sources confirm the practices of the Japanese to request apotropaic objects such as Agnus Dei, medals, relics, rosary beads, in substitution or in addition to Buddhist ones. In this role, the Virgin Mary was generally understood as a model of mulier fortis, the valiant woman. Other embodiments of this model are, for instance, biblical women such as Judith, or Roman virgin martyrs such as Saint Anastasia. On the emotional level, this trope exhibited mercy, humility, and fortitude in the face of difficulties and even martyrdom. However, when it came to motherhood, this model, I believe, was not sufficient. The valiant mother, so to say, when her children were martyrized, accompanied them and worried only that they did not abandon their faith at the critical moment. We have many examples in the lives of saints, for instance, especially these virgin martyrs or other kind of Roman martyrs. Indeed, the example of the mulier fortis required that a mother prioritized her love for God above all else, including love for her children. It was, therefore, not a particularly effective tool in this context. The Virgin Mary, however, traditionally embodied also a second model, the Mater Dolorosa. This example emerged in Christian tradition around the 13th century, following the contemporary trend that humanized Christ, and soon surpassed in popularity that of the mulier fortis. Still, as the Reformation began influencing European spirituality, popular Catholic images of Mary overcome by grief at the foot of the cross were met with condemnation. We can see here an example by Peter Canisius, very influential Jesuit theologians, that condemns those foolish women who, broken by grief, wail openly and beat their breasts with their fists, and tear their hair and scratch their cheeks with their nails. And he believed that this sort of description for the Virgin Mary was not dignified, really. The Jesuits in Japan had thus to find a balance between the model of the Mater Dolorosa and that of the mulier fortis to support both correct forms of motherhood and of sexual continence, which of course was always a problem with Catholic missionaries outside Europe and inside Europe. as they translated a meditation on the Rosary and its mysteries, for instance, the reflection on the Mater Dolorosa, which we can see in the first example, is substituted by an exhortation to be emuliar fortis. So this is an example from the Spiritual Shugyo, which is a printed collection that contains the adaptation of Istruzione et Avvertimenti per meditare i misteri del Rosario della Santissima Vergine Madre, written by a Jesuit called Gaspar de Loarte. And above you see the original Italian that focuses this meditation on the pain of the Virgin. And below, you can see the Japanese, we cannot even call it translation because it's completely new text, that substitutes instead this exhortation to basically take upon the woman the suffering of the Christ. This is a clear reaction to the pressure of the European context that required distancing of Mary from Jesus' unique experience of the Passion. At the same time, printed in 1607, the Spiritual Shugyo is also an answer to the needs of the persecuted Japanese kirishitan, who faced martyrdom as a probable future and required apt emotional models. It is at the crossroad of the contradictory urgencies of divine and human love that I would locate the collection of Marian miracles presented in the Barreto Codex, a manuscript held in the Vatican Apostolic Library. This volume contains various texts in Japanese romaji, so in Latin letters, that were used as a support for evangelizing activities and were copied in 1591 by missionary Manuel Barreto. Among these texts, we find a collection of 12 miracles of the Virgin, which reinforce Mary's role as divine intercessor par excellence. 3 major figures of mothers appear in it. Each woman embodies different practices of maternal emotions, which put them in the intentions of the authors at different stages of spiritual growth. The first mother is a Jewish woman from the well-known miracle of the Jewish boy, and is sometimes known as Rachel. She despairs when she believes that her son is dead and calls the Christian neighbors for help. The Virgin Mary intervened, saving the boy, and the grateful mother and son both converted. So, notice the expressive emotional practices of her love and pain. We see here 4 different examples. 2 are from the 13th century in the center, Barreto manuscript on the left, and a contemporary of the Barreto manuscript on the far right. So you can see that more or less they are describing the same scene. She raises her voice to the sky. She shows great feeling, ripping up her clothes and tearing at her hair, and tramples the ground and wails. And this clearly reflects what Canisius was condemning just a couple of slides before. So this miracle is taken basically straight from the medieval version. And so we can say that in this story, the emotional practices of love and pain of this mother led to her conversion and her salvation. She is saved by the love she has for her son that is expressed as pain when she believes he is dead. Okay, so let's go ahead to the second story. The second mother was a Christian, but in her despair of losing her own son, she kidnapped a statue of the baby Jesus and held it hostage until the Virgin Mary would not return her son. This is to a very famous medieval story. She obtained her wish, but she was condemned by the narration as sinful and lacking faith. Here we have an example of the Virgin Mary saving sinful people, even if they are not worth it. So again, the Virgin Mary's powers and the mother who is saved by her through, despite in a certain sense, her love for her son. So the text says her love was true, but she let despair get a hold of her, and she's condemned for this. The third mother loses her son to an accident in the kitchen in a sunken fireplace. And when she received the news, she reacts composedly, as illustrated by this citation. This is a speech she gives to the servants of the house. My child was given as a gift by Jesus Christ and Santa Maria. Now, as he is summoned back once again, I am exceedingly grateful, especially since it is on the occasion of this happy day, because it was a Marian feast, that we received this summon. Repeatedly, I must offer my thanks for this arrangement. After this scene, the Virgin Mary returned the son to the mother, more beautiful than when he died, to the mother's amazed happiness. This miracle probably has a Franciscan influence, but it seems to be an original Japanese composition. I was not able to actually find it anywhere, and I did search quite a bit. This is probably is based probably on the not so very famous miracle of the apples that presents Saint Francis instead of the Virgin Mary. So, since this was an original composition, I would argue that the shift in perception of correct maternal emotional practices tied to the image of the Virgin Mary meant that medieval tales did not offer current models of restrained emotional expression and acceptance that the Tridentine sensibility required. This is why I think they modified this Franciscan tale. And overall, I would say that the three mothers that appear in these tales offer models that are at different levels of spiritual advancement. And so, therefore, they could be easily adapted to the needs of the mission. I don't think it's a case that the first mother is actually not a Christian, she's Jewish, and the tale ends with her conversion. So, while, of course, the most spiritually advanced example is this final one with a mother that accepts the decision of heaven. So, to conclude, I hope I have shown today how emotional practices and the models that embodied them and circulated them within an emotional community could support evangelization, and in particularly its bid to change Japanese motherhood, as they strove to ban abortions and infanticides among their flock. The Jesuits adapted traditional Catholic literature to not only a new historical moment impacted by the Reformation, but also to a new cultural context, as was that of Japan. Understood to be universal, emotions and their practices offered an apparently simple channel to transmit new values and support new needs, as cultural differences were assimilated in apparently straightforward categories inherited from the past, such as sin and ignorance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Linda. So we have some time for questions. So does anybody have any questions or comments that they would like to raise? Okay.
Yeah, I will.
Oh, go ahead, please. Yes.
No, go, Joe.
Oh, okay. So I have one question that I think it gets to, I think, a component of your thesis, but in some respects it kind of maybe goes in a slightly different direction, which is when we talk about emotions, how does the emotion of fear play out in this regard? And in particular, because I'm thinking of during this period, in Europe, you have the discourse surrounding witches, etc., and infanticide and these other kinds of practices. Did those creep in any way, shape, or form into the discourse of the Jesuits as they encountered the Japanese and as they understood them as, participating in these kind of infanticides, and abortion, etc., connecting that in any way to witchcraft?
Yes, thank you. You actually hit two major themes of part I could not present here. I will start with the witches discussion because fear is massive. It's a massive discourse. So I will start with the, let's say, easier one. So witches are not immediately present in Jesuit discourse. But you can really see how this obsession with witches, which was tied to practices of abortion specifically, but also infanticide, you can see how this discourse on witches impacts everything that is happening in Japan. And you can see it in two ways, I would say. The first is that you can trace very clear historical change in European laws and by extension culture from the 16th, very early 16th century to I think was the end of the 17th century, in which abortions and infanticides are persecuted, is that the word? Persecuted more and more basically by the law. We start at the beginning of the 16th century when Charles V emits his new set of laws for his dominions, which is basically half of Europe and a great chunk of the Americas. And in these laws, abortion and infanticide becomes an act against the law in addition to be a sin. So at that point, it can be persecuted by the state. And before that, it was just considered a sin. We know, of course, that once a woman was accused of that, the state's officials would, carry out the sentence and so on and so forth. But this is the first time in which it is encased in a state law. And there is a craze to look for this sort of sins and practices until the end of the 17th century. And the punishment gets worse and worse. At a certain point, they're like drawn and quartered, which was a very peculiar punishment. And then at the end of the 17th century, a new understanding of the woman's ability of, let's say, be rational comes in. So at that point, women are not really persecuted anymore because they're not rational enough. They're not considered rational enough to actually understand what they have done in a certain sense. So this sort of disappears in the 18th century. This sort of disappears. A second point that I think relates to this discussion on witches is that the witches category is quite wide, and it includes heretics, Jewish people, and all sort of relative figures. And it is in connection with the figure of the heretic that the Buddhist monk is depicted in Japan. So the first thing that Francis Xavier apparently says, because again, we are using a source from 35 years later. It's a good source, but I'm a bit skeptical on this specific detail. It appears anyway that the first thing that Francis Xavier, the first missionary to Japan, did was accuse the Buddhist monks to support abortions, because he accused them of having sexual relationships with the Buddhist nuns. And so to cover this sin, they would have the nuns have abortions. And again, this reflects an understanding of the heretic, of the pagan, of all these figures that were not Christian and therefore could not understand the sanctity of life. Let's put it more or less like that. So I think that the context of witches is really important in this. And of course, witches were connected to sexual reproduction and so on and so forth, of course. So, okay, so when it comes to fear, I have been working on fear because it is one of the most immediate emotions, I think, in a situation of civil war and persecution. I would think that fear would be expected to be there. And okay, so fear is not there. I can tell you that. So fear is not there. And that's when it sort of pinged in my mind that this should be investigated. Fear is not present in Jesuit literature. Ulrike Strasser has written quite a bit about this, and mostly because it was not an emotion that was associated with faith. A really faithful person would always trust God, right? But more specifically, it is not associated with masculinity. Real men do not feel fear, and Jesuits were real men. There were quite a bit of pressure for the Jesuits being priests and not being married and not being, let's say, traditional masculine models. There was quite a bit of pressure on the Jesuits to demonstrate that they were men. So gendered expectations influenced this absence of fear, or let's say a repetition of fear in very limited situations, and the tropes that are repeated. You're initially afraid, but then your faith in God helps you to get out. And this is the example par excellence of these that is found in all Jesuit literature is consolation. Consolation is a movement from, let's say, negative emotions that are mostly tied to the negative influence of the world as a Christian concept. So the sin of the world and so on and so forth, towards a better feeling, more positive feelings that are associated with the presence of God. So consolation is a Jesuit's feeling that God is with him and approves of his acts. So, as I was saying, Jesuit texts are full of references to this articulated emotion. And studies have shown that generally what is expressed is the second part of this chain of emotions. Fear is not mentioned because, again, it's not edifying. At the same time, and I sort of need to stop here because this is like the last edge of my research. I still have to work more on this. But if you have a look at these texts, such as the Spiritual Shugyo that I showed, and other similar translations, such as the Imitatio Christi, other texts like that were translated into Japanese, if you have a look at the concept of consolation, it completely disappears in Japanese. There's no consolation in the Japanese version. There is only reference to joy. And I mean, they did know it was joy. It's not like they did not know a word in Japanese to express consolation. There was, the dictionaries have that word. So I think, as a sort of interpretation, temporary interpretation for now, I think that the process in Japan was taken a step further, and that even the negative side of consolation completely disappears by focusing just on joy. And this is tied to other issues, let's call them like that the Jesuits had in Japan. One included the recommendation by Francis Xavier of always treating Japanese people with kindness. So not to make them too afraid of hell, probably because Francis Xavier understood that the Buddhists had already the major slice of the market on this sort of discourse. So he did not want to scare away, let's say like that, the new converts, potential converts. And so technically, in theory, Japanese converts are always treated very kindly. In practice, this does not really work. There are a lot of problems, but and the Japanese converts complaining. But I do think that this is part of a step of moving away from fear, basically, in the preaching of the Jesuits. Yes, so this is very briefly what is going on with fear. And mostly, yes, I think that there is for certain an attempt to distance Christianity from fear, from death. Representation of the crucified Jesus are always hidden away, which is also why I think the Virgin Mary emerges as the primary representation of Christianity in Japan. But as I said, it's really my latest work, and I think I need to dig deeper than just this. It would be very interesting to see on a lived religion level what is going on, actually, rather than just textually.
Thank you very much, Linda. If I could just ask a real quick follow-up. Do phrases such as fear of God get then rendered differently into Japanese, or is it more reverence for God or something like that? Or do those like kinds of phrases get?
Yeah, they don't really show up.
Okay, that's interesting.
Fear, I mean, sorry, I did concentrate on consolation, but actually fear does not really show up much itself. There is one exception, because this is also valid for the history of the mission. Fear has taken a very small role in it, although you do understand that the Jesuits were terrified of this very unstable situation of civil war, but they don't speak of it. And one example is when Louis Frois speaks of Nagasaki. Nagasaki was a Catholic city under the government of Catholic governors, basically, which were basically the arms of the Jesuits. And in cases of infanticide and abortion, women were whipped. It was the only place in Japan where this could be carried out, because it was the only place in Japan where political power was in the hands of the Christians. And I think it is in this an example of a woman that had been caught doing an abortion, that Louis Frois says that the fear of God is understood very well in Nagasaki. I think it is one of the very few examples. It's interesting, it's connected exactly with this sort of practices that needed to be punished.
Thank you. Piera, did you have a question?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Linda, for your beautiful presentation. And yeah, following, let's say, the other presentations that we had, really your lecture showed the role of emotions in shaping the illicit, but also how the construction of the illicit comes together with the construction of emotions. So it's very interesting. I have a question about, let's say, herbs, or let's say the ways that abortions were produced. And I ask this because one of the biggest, most important work about how knowledge is constructed and how also ignorance is constructed in times of in colonial times is the work of Londa Schimbinger and on plants and empire. So working more on the, let's say, Americas, that is my field. And let's say that I think that is fascinating to think how the knowledge around abortion was completely deleted. So also the knowledge about plants and the abortive properties of plants. And so I was curious if maybe you came across like references about plants, or what kind of, yeah, I'm sorry to say, but what kind of techniques or what kind of knowledges, and if religion also was involved not only in emotions, but also in the way that knowledge was shaped.
Yes, thank you. That's another fascinating question. And okay, so what I can say. The Jesuits start out due also to these preconceived ideas they have, with the idea that Buddhist monks are behind the practices of abortion and they have taught them to the laity. This is very easy way out of, condemning just part of the population, but saying that everybody else is very nice if not for this, but which was it was a key statement to deal with Japanese people. Okay, but so one would expect some connection with the Buddhist institutions. I have to say, I was not able to actually find this connection at all. In the sense that I have very limited knowledge. I have tried to actually dig deeper into this, but I'm not sure. It seems I have hit some sort of area not very well mapped, and it's outside my expertise, so I can just report what I've read, basically. So already in the 10th century, 11th century, herbal knowledge, herbal medicinal knowledge was in the hands of doctors. So these doctors could be at the same time connected in some ways to to Buddhism in general, but very rarely to Buddhist institutions, from what I see. So they were like traveling monks. And first of all, they were doctors. So the category of doctor exists as a thing on itself in a certain sense. The religious connection does not appear to be so important. At the same time, it does not seem, from what I know of traditional Japanese medicine, which of course very, very much tied with traditional Chinese medicine, from what I know of it, it was its aim was to support pregnancies, not to put an obstacle to them, basically. We have plenty of studies and plenty of primary documents, such as books on, fertility, how to enhance fertility, and so on and so forth. I could not find a single reference to actually abortion in any of them. And when we see description of practices in Japanese texts, first of all, they are not from this period, because we don't really have many descriptions at all. But for later periods, we see that herbs specifically were not really used that much, which is weird. I was also expecting some sort of use in this sense, but they mostly used blunt trauma to provoke abortions, insertion of objects, and similar techniques, basically, from what I can understand. And the Buddhist monks were not really, had nothing to do with it, basically, in a certain sense. So this is more or less what I can say on this topic. Japan is an interesting case, if we want to call it like that, when it comes to colonial presence, colonial impacts, also in these sort of knowledges, because of course Japan was never really a colony and was subjected to strong European and American influences for a very brief period. So we do have a lot of knowledge of what traditional medicine looks like. And I have to say, so from this point of view, I can see the connection that you were making with the Americas, but it's quite different as a context. And again, I was holding the same assumptions you were, because that makes sense. But I could not really find any sort of support for them in what I could read. I had a look at Japanese literature, had a look at American literature. I did try to find, but I don't know if there is some sort of attempt to bypass these topics. I'm not in contemporary research. I'm not sure what is going on exactly. I'm sorry. This is really the most I can say. I did try, but did not come up with much.
Thank you very much. For sure, there is on both sides, there is the fact that knowledge about abortive practices is omitted, is delayed.
Yes.
This
yes.
was all the story also of doctors coming back from the Americas. They were not reporting that certain plants.
Yes, because it was of course it was dangerous knowledge.
So there is 100 years of complete ignorance about abortive practices, also because of this. It was part of the agenda. So thank you very much. It's very, very fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments? Oh, I think we have a question here in the chat from Maciej. Hello. Okay. So the question is, concerns the Jesuit idea that the Japanese are incapable of loving. Do we see this in other missionary contexts in Asia? And do we encounter any Jesuit writings on why this is? Does ethnicity come into play in this? That is it inherent in being Japanese, or do they have the capability of love being taught?
Thank you. Thank you. This is very interesting. I sort of had to rush through this concept because I wanted to give a bit of a context, but time was what it was. So yes, the idea that Japanese people were not capable of love derives mostly from our contemporary perspective, from the fact that love was a very specific religious category. And therefore, when I say love, what I actually mean is caritas, which again was very broad, but it's important to remember that some elements of what we would call love nowadays did not belong to caritas and were actually part of sinful love. One of these, for instance, is loving your children too much. This was a typical problem attributed to mothers. They loved their children too much, so they did not punish them where they sin, or discourses of this kind. So we are talking about caritas. Okay, so the problem of love was not really prominent in China, for instance, in the Chinese mission, mostly because the Jesuits there, of course, were building on Confucian principles, and many of these could be tied to caritas, some forms of caritas, mostly love for the neighbor and so on and so forth. And anyway, most of the Jesuit missionaries in China did not deal with women, full point. There were, of course, women and were very important, but their official discussion was about mandarins and places of power where women were not really present that much. And I cannot think of other missions that had the time to actually develop this much physically, to actually build up more of a discussion about love. But I can confirm that not so much ethnicity, but let's say culture was understood, each culture was understood as having a problem with a specific emotion, for instance. For instance, First Nations of Canada and North America had a problem with fear. The Jesuits perceived that fear was the problematic emotion in that case. And so absolutely there was a connection. There was an attempt to identify an emotional other, to depict an emotional other on which then the Jesuit could work, because of course the final objective here was to convert them. So they focused on one and then work on that, starting from their own principles. And of course, since Japanese people were expected to convert and were recognized this ability to convert, of course, this problem of love could be overcome. Other cultures, other ethnicities, most of the Jesuits had given up. For example, attempting to convert Muslims was considered a waste of time. Not by everybody, of course, but the general discussion was that. But the Japanese people were considered white, and therefore they were able to love. They just needed to come out from the influence of the terrible Buddhist monks, basically. That was the discussion, right? So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Linda, for a wonderful presentation and discussion. And we should just highlight also in the chat, for those of you who are here, that the next lecture will be by David Frankfurt, who will talk about idols on the 17th of April. Sorry for these announcements that are coming through my screen. So this will be taking place on the 17th of April at 3 o'clock p.m. and the Zoom link is on the poster, which will also spread around. So again, thank you very much, Linda, for a wonderful presentation. And
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.